Hello, everyone. Again, good morning. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am very proud to be moderating today's panel, exploring the themes, dynamics, and political implications of President Biden's trip to Angola this week, and some of the broader issues, both economic and political, that are surging through that region in Africa today. But first, if you are not familiar with the Quincy Institute, we are an action tank committed to moving American foreign policy toward diplomacy and positive engagement and away from the primary tools of militarism and economic coercion as a way to establish U.S. primacy abroad. So Biden traveled to Angola this week. It was his first such trip to Sub-Saharan Africa in his four-year term, and the first of an American president since Barack Obama traveled to Sub-Saharan Africa 3 times during his own 2 terms in office. Much of the trip focused this week on the Lobito project, an 810-mile railroad connecting Angola with neighboring Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We will delve into that and the reasons why both President Biden and President João Lourenço called this a proud, historic moment and a turning point in the relationship between the two nations. We will also talk about how U.S. relations are faring with other African governments and the prospects for any change, good and bad, in the upcoming Trump administration. But first, let me introduce our esteemed panel. Ziyanda Stuurman is a senior analyst for Southern Africa at the Eurasia Group, where she analyzes political and economic developments with a focus on South Africa, Mozambique, and Angola. Ziyanda has been a policy researcher in the South African Parliament, and she has worked as an advisor on policymaking with a development economics think tank based at the University of Cape Town. Elizabeth Shackelford is the Senior Policy Director at Dartmouth's Dickey Center for International Understanding and a foreign affairs columnist for the Chicago Tribune. Previously, she was a Senior Fellow on U.S. Foreign Policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Before that, she served as a career diplomat in the U.S. State Department until September 2017, with postings in Poland, South Sudan, and Somalia. She is the author of The Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age, which chronicles the challenges facing U.S. foreign policy in the modern world. And Dan Ford is my colleague and junior research fellow in the Global South program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Previously, Dan worked as a research and communications assistant at the Global Interagency Security Reform. Thank you so much for joining me today, all of you. This is a really excellent panel and great timing for this discussion on Biden's, one of the last trips, if not his last global trip of his presidency. So I'd like to start by asking each of you, what should we take away from the fact that A, Biden has not traveled yet to Sub-Saharan Africa throughout the 4 years of his presidency, and B, that his one and only trip to this region was to Angola? And what did you think of the results? Like, what were your takeaways of this week's trip, the press reporting of it, the takeaways from his relationship with President Lourenço there? What can you tell me? Let's start with you, Ziyanda.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly, for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. I think it's really interesting to think about, why Biden has only been able to make one trip to the African continent. I think particularly given, that he hosted the US-Africa Summit in Washington in December 2022. There, between himself and Vice President Kamala Harris, repeatedly said that the US government was all in on Africa. I think what we should take away from that is that this has been a very noisy time in geopolitics and in international affairs. The Russia-Ukraine war, of course, conflict in the Middle East, and everything else in between has been, I think, a really huge distraction in many ways to many different countries. The US is one of them, but Angola is another. That's a country that's had a difficult year as well. So it's, I think that it is really interesting to have picked Angola, particularly in this moment in time, and with a president like João Lourenço, who's really set himself up to be a reformer in many ways. We'll get into a little bit of that later. But really, the takeaway here is that this is a historic inflection in U.S.-Africa relations, and I think particularly U.S.-Angola relations.
Yes, I mean, I would agree with Ziyanda on, largely this geopolitical period we've been in for the past few years has been, it's really made it inevitable that Africa is going to be the first region on the chopping block of priorities for any U.S. administration. So I'm not at all surprised that given how busy the world has been with other crises, that, a lot of a very energetic approach to U.S. Africa policy at the start of the Biden administration did really start to peter down. At the end of the day, I think that this trip was made to happen because it had long been promised and it had been postponed repeatedly. I think it was very important to the Biden administration and particularly the really relentless teams at the National Security Council focused on Africa to make sure that this promise was fulfilled. How important was this trip at the end of the day? Well, a lot less important with Biden as a lame duck president at this point, but I think it still does matter. And one of the reasons that I think that it will matter is because the focus on Angola as the center of this trip was about financial and economic investment and partnership, and not what the U.S. has really focused on, really prioritized previously in its Africa relationships, which has really been a focus on counterterrorism, military partnerships, and a lot of focus on at least talking, if not doing a lot, about democracy and human rights. So this was a very different focus. And I think because it has that kind of economic investment focus, that there is much more of a chance that this will be built off of by the Trump administration coming in. So I do expect that the Trump administration's focus on Africa is going to be primarily, with kind of economic and trade and investment focal points. And so wrapping up the Biden administration's Africa policy focus with this trip, it has a lot more promise for something that's going to be built on by the next administration.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Dan? That like this real palpable shift away from security and development, or at least the kind of development programs that we are used to seeing or conversing about in this part of the world, and more towards the economic development, that the Lobito project. What do you think of that shift, and how does it portend for where the conversation might be going on Africa in the next administration?
Yeah, I think it's a sign that the administration's at least heeding some of the calls from Africans for greater and deeper economic investment on a number of fronts. This is a really complicated project. There are a lot of different funding streams. There are a lot of partners involved. One sign that the project will likely move forward, regardless of who the U.S. president is the fact that the U.S. isn't the sole funder of this project. It's a G7 initiative under PGI, which stands for Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is essentially the G7's response to the Belt and Road Initiative. The Italians are putting up over $300 million. The U.S. has put up in the billions now, but so have local Africans. The African Development Bank and Africa Finance Corporation has also contributed to this project. So there are a lot of funding streams involved. That'll continue regardless of who the president is. I agree with Lizzie that the fact that it is sort of an economic project is sort of a good sign that it'll likely be continued into the next administration. We know that Donald Trump has spoken about being a deal maker, and he wants to privatize a lot of things, I think, that the U.S. government does. And I think, working with the private sector to build this complex and comprehensive corridor is something that can be done in the next administration. And from the folks I've heard, I think it's likely to be continued, at least largely, as is currently the case. The fact that he, hasn't had a bilateral trip to Africa until now. His only trip was COP, which is, of course, a multilateral event in Egypt a couple of years ago. Again, it sort of signals that Africa hasn't been very high on the list of priorities. Somewhat understandable given the wars in Ukraine and Gaza and other issues going on in the world, but certainly a little bit late for a trip to Angola. Having said that, this is tied directly to the Lobito Corridor, which he wants to be really his lasting legacy on the continent, and that's why he chose Angola.
Thank you, Dan. Ziyanda, I'd like to get more into the Lobito project with you. I, as a non-Africa expert myself, this is the first time hearing about it, but all of the coverage of the trip, of Biden's trip this week has focused on that corridor, the infrastructure associated with it, and the U.S. investment in it. Can you tell our viewers what this corridor project is, a little bit of the history, and what the hopes are for it, for the region, the benefits for the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the project itself is incredibly interesting because it is a kind of stitching together and a patchwork of what was colonial rail infrastructure, with the backbone of it really being the Benguela rail line, which was built in colonial era Angola, and that had been damaged over several years and several decades. And that's now being connected to a rail corridor and a dry port in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and extended out into Zambia. Both of those two countries have large deposits of a lot of critical minerals that the US, the EU, and the rest of the world is really going to lean on quite heavily in the years to come in terms of the global energy transition. And this runs the gamut from lithium to cobalt to copper to nickel. And really this project is about bridging all three countries, with this modern freight rail corridor that really drastically reduces how long it takes to move products from one part of the continent to the other, and importantly, to a port in southern Angola that is primed or in prime position to export out to, again, many of the EU member states, as well as the US. So for the broader region, this already carries, I think, a lot of promise and a lot of potential, not just for those three countries, but for Angola, I think in particular, really heralds an opportunity for 4 provinces in the south of the country that have been economically underdeveloped to leapfrog, I think, in many ways into the future. And again, as I said, I think very importantly, into a future in which the supply of critical minerals is critical in and of itself.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that, Ziyanda. There does seem to be some criticism that this is all about exporting to the rest of the world, and this might not benefit the region in terms of keeping manufacturing here, keeping the minerals here, and being able to produce things with them, and not just shunting off all of this lucrative business elsewhere. Can you talk a little? Will this railway help development projects and facilities, manufacturing in the region, so that it's not all exported, and that Africa can actually benefit itself from all these critical minerals?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and not unfortunately, but it does really depend on the various African governments that are involved in this project themselves. I think that it would be difficult to say to private companies that are invested in this project, you're going to have to, at scale, also invest in the industrialization of these three countries. So that is very much on I think these three governments involved. But as I said, there's huge potential for not just a rail corridor and not just the establishment of special economic zones, but honestly, the growth of new industries completely. The beneficiation of many of these minerals long before they're exported out of the continent could very easily happen, in all three countries, for there to be real value add and for there to be genuine export revenue, not just as you were saying again, just locked into the extractive industry. I think that is going to take a huge investment in human capital and education systems, in road and electrification infrastructure, but certainly as one, all of those endeavors could pay off handsomely for every country involved, and even neighboring countries. When you think about the spillover effect of a project this big.
Absolutely. Lizzie, what about China? How much of this trip, this pursuit of new infrastructure for Angola, is a recognition by Biden and the US that it has largely fallen behind Beijing and its economic influence in Angola and other parts of Africa? How much is great power politics at play here?
100%. I mean, just to be blunt, the United States with its, we've been very involved on the African continent with a lot of these countries for many, many years, but the nature of US engagement has been very different from that of China. And, as a US diplomat who spent a lot of my time on the continent, we would often talk about, or hear about, our culture isn't just to leave big things. It wasn't our kind of development culture to build things, to leave infrastructure because it was unsustainable. It required upkeep that, other countries that are doing that aren't necessarily doing. We wanted to, do more development that would have longer term impact. Well, that really hasn't paid off. And what we have seen is that while there are a lot of problems, there have been a lot of challenges with China's engagement, there is some big payoff for some of the large infrastructure projects that they've been able to do. I just returned a few days ago from a trip to Kenya, and the railway that China has put in Kenya has really been a game changer for a lot of things there. That is not to say there aren't challenges. There's debt and issues like that. But I think what we've realized in recent years is that there is a big payoff in terms of the perceptions across the continent with those kind of physical things that you can see and feel and touch and use that are left there by kind of Chinese investment, and we don't necessarily have that to show. I mean, a lot of our investment in democracy, democracy and democratization efforts has really, you look all across West Africa where democracies that we've been investing in have been failing. So that's not really leaving that kind of concrete value add that a lot of Africans can see. So that's a little bit of an oversimplification of the issue. Of course, this is very complex, but I think we've realized that we're not going to get to where we want to be with influence on the African continent without helping growth in Africa. And what we have been doing has been falling short there. So, I think that if you look at this just, kind of from a raw geopolitical perspective, the United States feels like we've been falling behind. And that is one of the reasons that we're basically taking a page out of China's playbook. We're falling behind in some other areas, though, that I hope we'll be able to also match. China now has more consulates and embassies across the continent than we have. That is something that is new and has happened in the last generation or less. We have, fewer African students coming to the United States to study. I mean, there are a lot of things that China has done to really enhance its influence in recent years, and I think that we're taking some hard lessons from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, do you have anything to add to the Lobito Corridor project thread before we move on? I know, and I'll just throw this out there, that one of the concerns always is that the benefits won't go to the people. And I know that Angola has been suffering from poverty, and their debt is, I think, at 17% to China right now. And so they're struggling to pay off the debt. They're struggling to give their people a living wage there, many living under the poverty level. Can you talk a little bit about the concerns about, like, wow, billions of dollars are going into this project, everybody's heralding it, but why are the people still poor? Will this actually sort of translate into better living and life for the people of Angola?
Yeah, that's a pretty fundamental question, Kelly. Helena Matza, who is the PGI coordinator at the U.S. State Department, has given interviews where she sort of talked about this issue on behalf of the U.S. government. Of course, she works for the government, and their response is that they're taking more of a localized approach to this project than in previous development projects. And because it's a comprehensive infrastructure project that's being funded by multiple streams, including locally, as I mentioned, with the African Development Bank and Africa Finance Corporation, and is being really developed as separate projects that are all supposed to come together with different goals that, again, are all supposed to come together to build this comprehensive corridor. It should take into account local concerns better than previous projects have, and it should be able to withstand funding cycles and then eventually, hopefully, kind of be privatized and have profit motive and profit incentive to have private companies trade and use the corridor for decades into the future. There is, I think, signs that that's happening. I mean, the Africa Development Bank has contributed, I think, about $1 billion to this project. Africa Finance Corporation as well is, I think, taking a very heavy funding and management of the second phase, which is going to go down into Zambia. So there are signs that that's going to happen. There are also, in addition to rail, there are a lot of other infrastructure projects that are part of this. There's solar infrastructure that's being built. The U.S. Export-Import Bank announced during Biden's trip $900 million of a loan for solar infrastructure in Angola. This is in addition to other solar infrastructure. There are bridges being built as well, and feeder roads that are going to connect the rail to local villages and other communities to help tie this corridor together a bit better to the local communities. It's also going to allow the local countries to trade amongst themselves. It isn't just going to end up leading to goods being shipped externally, although of course I do think that was the motive for the project starting in the first place. But there are benefits to the local countries being able to trade with one another. Goods that are that took 45 days now take 45 hours to go from a small village into the port, and it's already starting to see some goods being shipped. So, there's hope that this will be a bit more. It'll allow for some downstream supply chains locally. I think there's a very real possibility that that's the case. We'll have to wait and see, but yeah, that's the hope.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, so let's get to what I know everybody is thinking and wondering about, and that's where do we go from here in the Trump administration? This is his second term, and so there's some history there that I hope Lizzie will get into a little bit that might inform like what his next administration might look like in regards to Africa policy, U.S. Africa policy. So what do we expect in the coming, months, year of the new administration? According to University of Cincinnati professor Alex Thurston, who writes for Responsible Statecraft quite regularly on these issues, Trump and his team will likely not be thinking much about Africa. He points to an article by Professor Stephen Wald, who's also associated with Quincy, writing about the 10 foreign policy implications of the 2024 U.S. election, in which he didn't even mention Africa because the Middle East, Ukraine, NATO, China, among other issues, will likely take center stage rather, and leaving Africa as usual behind. If Trump ignores Africa, he says, this is Alex Thurston now, that would be in keeping with a bipartisan neglect of the continent from the time of Barack Obama through the present rather. Lizzie, let's start with you. You actually worked in the first Trump administration. What are your thoughts about what a second Trump administration might look like in regards to U.S. Africa policy?
Well, when it comes to the continent, personnel is really policy here. As you've mentioned, Donald Trump does not care about the continent. I think the best that we can hope for out of the kind of top of the administration is that he refrains from some of the broad-ranging insults to the entire continent that he imposed before, the Muslim travel ban, the shithole countries, et cetera, et cetera. So if we can get Donald Trump to completely avoid going that route and just basically ignore Africa, I think we're actually going to be doing better than we did last time. But then where you're going to look to see what the policy really is going to be who gets appointed to lead his Africa policy. Who's going to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa? Who is he going to appoint for his leads in the National Security Council? Again, I don't think he cares a lot about these issues, so it's just going to be a matter of who he taps to lead it. And there are a couple of different things that we might see, depending on who ends up in place. I think that we could see and likely will see a real focus on the economic investment. The question will be how much they're able to do or are interested in doing. A lot of the Trump administration is likely going to be reflected on, what are the business interests of some of Trump's allies. So if there are some who are thinking we really want to get in here and get better access to critical minerals that we need for a wide variety of issues from national security to otherwise in the United States, we could see the facilitation of making it easier for American investors to work and thrive on the continent. If you look at Project 2025, which we'll see how much of that gets implemented, but there's very little on Africa in it. Although, to be fair, it's not particularly, alarming or unobjectionable. It doesn't really demonstrate a really big shift from what the Biden administration has talked about, but it does talk about creating space for American companies to invest, and of course, on the focus on countering China. So I expect that we will see that kind of shift away from military partnerships to continue towards really an economic focus. The question is going to be how much is invested in that policy. I'd say the other thing to watch out for, though, is going to be on the cultural front, which is, I believe Project 2025 specifically talks about getting away from kind of, cultural, finger wagging and pushing particular ideas of, kind of liberal international ideas with our Africa policy in the future. But there is a very large evangelical influence on the Trump administration. And so depending on how involved they get in Africa policy, we actually could end up seeing a big investment in kind of promoting the culture wars that, that we have seen some who support the Trump administration fighting here in the United States. There is an evangelical, kind of extremist evangelical backing to the anti-LGBTQ laws that have been pushed in different parts of the continent. And so, I'm keeping an eye open to see if that becomes an actual official part of U.S. policy on the continent. But I expect the biggest chunk is going to be on the kind of economic focus.
Ziyanda, let's delve into that a little bit more. I know you probably don't have your eyes on how every leader in Africa has responded to Trump, but in general, has his election been a welcome news? Have you seen commentary from different capitals? I mean, how are leaders in Africa accepting the second Trump administration? And is it just and I would imagine it's a mixed bag, but can you talk a little bit about how people are, or how leaders are positioning themselves for this new reality?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll start at a super basic microcosm level. As an African living on the continent, I would love for Trump to ignore the continent again. It's helpful in the sense that that there are a number of projects that don't necessarily lie at the White House level or at the high executive level. They're further down in the bureaucracy, and they really keep the engine of what is U.S. Africa policy running. And this really runs the gamut from USAID to projects that were launched under Power Africa under Barack Obama, as well as AGOA, the preferential trade platform, and others as well. So there would be a sense of normalcy if as Lizzie said, I think Trump refrained from necessarily keeping Africa top of mind. If we look a bit more broadly across the continent, there's some really interesting relationships that formed and flourished under Biden, and at least the rhetorical sort of outreach to the African continent. And an example here is Kenya. That's hopefully looking forward to continuing what I think were really good relations with the US. South Africa has had a very rocky relationship with the US for a long time, and I think that was true to a certain extent in the last few years. But very broadly, I think the general sort of feeling with many African governments, and to make this a little bit, I think, partisan, when you have a Republican president in the White House, relationships are usually transactional. Not a lot is expected of each other from either side. I think that there's more effort in terms of soft diplomacy, under democratic presidents. At least there has been in the past. So it's a sort of return to that normal, that sort of swing between these two parties and the way that government and foreign policy works. I think there'll be a return to that sort of normal. And as I said, I think as long as Trump isn't laser focused, on one particular country or another, very broadly, I think a lot of relationships will at least stay stable.
Thank you. So Dan, I want you to play a little game with me. I want you to put on your Trump hat, and I want you to imagine a landscape in which Donald Trump is laser focused on Africa, but in a very positive way. And maybe you can imagine yourself as his chief advisor on Africa relations. What would you recommend to Donald Trump in terms of what he should be doing on the continent, and what the most positive projection of U.S. involvement would look like?
Well, I think the continent is big and broad, and there are a lot of challenges, and I think there are a lot of sort of avenues to go down. But certainly, I would encourage the president to continue funding the Lobito Corridor, and work to sort of find ways to deepen supply chains locally in the countries that are connected to this corridor. I do think moving more to a DFC model, Development Finance Corporation here in the U.S., as opposed to more traditional USAID funded projects, I think that there's a good reason to do that. I think that that's more likely to lead to greater privatization. You also have to find ways to connect private enterprise in Africa. The population on the continent is going to double in the next quarter century. That's a lot of people that need resources, that will need access to jobs and money, and then we'll have to spend them. And I think there's an opportunity for U.S. businesses to engage. That's something that I think is music to Trump's ears, and I think something that he would want to have as part of his legacy when he finishes his second term in 4 years. There are other conflicts that are complicated, and I think I probably will echo what my co-panelists have said, and I would probably advise the president to do nothing, as opposed to get super involved and perhaps make a tough situation worse. I think Sudan's a complicated one, where you have the current administration has tried to provide an end to that war. It's a war that risks spreading into a regional conflict. Tom Perriello is the current special envoy. I would emphasize sort of a continued diplomatic effort to end that conflict. It's unlikely anything will happen as long as you have outside forces that continue to arm the RSF and the SAF, the paramilitary and the government forces. So I would naturally encourage the president to put pressure on the UAE to stop funding the RSF, and then the Egyptians and Iranians that are also contributing to that conflict. I think it's unlikely that that conflict will end soon. It could worsen. It could lead to a total separation of two parts of the country. But I think that's something that I would like to see the president perhaps use a little bit of diplomatic leverage to see an end to that war. But again, I think, when you're talking about Trump, the economic engagement is really central. And on that, AGOA, which has been mentioned, is the major trade deal. It's up for renewal in September of next year. That's something that from folks I've talked to, they hope to see that renewed. Devil's in the details, and there's some controversy over how exactly it should be renewed and how the details should look. But I think focusing on moving that forward would be good for the U.S.
Lizzie, it does seem like everybody is in agreement, whether here or on both sides of the aisle, in numerous administrations, that economic development must happen, and it must happen with private industry coming in and creating jobs and creating markets locally and regionally. But we have the security situation that Dan had mentioned. Sudan. We've seen instability in places like Mali over the last several months. Coups and in numerous places. The Congo. there are a lot of unknowns. So how does the Trump administration try to help resolve some of the security issues so companies will feel comfortable building and investing locally in Africa?
I mean, that's that's certainly a huge question, and it's not something that the U.S. government has failed to try in the past. But yeah, I've written it and done research on this before and made some recommendations in the past about, taking a really scrutinizing our approach to military assistance in the past, which, I fear has really helped to expand the security problems rather than reduce them. But, I look at a Trump administration, and there are a lot of ways, I'll just be frank, that I fear a Trump administration. But on the African continent, I think that maybe there is an opportunity to break away from some of our kind of traditional paths. I look at this, I mean, I hear what Dan says about Sudan. Sudan's really difficult. In my dream world of what positive could come out of this, could someone, some evangelical supporter of Trump with a lot of money, come to him and say, Sudan's causing huge problems. We don't like this. It's causing mass levels of suffering, and that's also not good for expanding in the economic engagement in the region. Can you do something about this? And having Trump take his kind of wild man, I'm unexpected, we aren't sure what I'm going to do, and go to the UAE and say, you're stealing all this gold with the use of some militia there. I need you to stop it, or I'm going to take away the weapons we're providing you. I mean, those are the types of approaches that I have heard American diplomats, including the Special Envoy Perriello, who are looking at what's happening in Sudan as a specific example and saying, well, it's difficult. Yes, the UAE, we're putting pressure on them. We're telling them that. But are we really making, a hard push on a close security ally to change fundamentally what's happening in Sudan to bring peace? And I'm not going to hold my breath. But I do think that someone who's willing to break away from the diplomatic approach we've taken in the past, and take a strong stance on something, maybe we could see something different. We haven't done a lot of good so far, so it's worth trying something different. But I do think that, it comes to what the Trump administration values. And if someone, the imaginary guidance, as Dan, as his close advisor on Africa, or any one of us, can say, if you want to make this a place where your wealthy friends make money, you have to bring security. And what does that mean? And if you're looking at Sudan, I've made some suggestions. We've got to get our partner to stop funding genocidal maniacs there. On the Sahel, it's a really hard issue. We've had this obstacle of, how do we deal with and work with coup governments, military takeovers. Maybe a Trump administration can take a different approach because it doesn't have, quite as many qualms about working in that region. I personally would like to see, not to abandon our focus on values, but to shift from, the trappings of democracy to who's providing good governance, because good governance brings stability in places that means that U.S. investors and companies can come and build. And so can we convince the Trump administration to actually care about good governance, whatever that governance is?
Ziyanda, did you just to follow up on that? I mean, what do you think of the idea of this shift to economic stability, economic investment, and possibly away from some of the democracy building that the United States has engaged in and has connected to a lot of its projects and investments there? Do you agree with the critique that I've heard? And again, I'm not an Africa expert, so I'm just hearing things at a different level here. That doesn't matter as much to China, and that's why China has been a little bit more effective at infrastructure projects and in joining a lot of these governments, because they don't have the trappings of the connections of the democracy building and all these other things. Can you talk a little bit about what the United States might do, or the West in general, to sort of be more effective?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I think a great way to always answer this sort of question is, to repeat the quote. And now I can't even remember where the quote comes from, but the really great quote that sums it all up I think it was an African official had once said, when the US goes to Africa, they go to give a lecture. When China goes to Africa, they build a bridge or an airport. I think that level of realpolitik, in fully understanding that all of these various governments have agency, that there are complicated and complex societies, where you're not just going to be able to, stamp a version of democracy or a version of liberal values, and then, almost as I think Kelly, you had pointed out, kind of finger wag and say, you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right. I think that kind of approach and is welcome, as I was just saying with the quote, but is also realistic about where various countries are, in their idea and in their conception of good governance and leadership. And I'm certainly not saying that autocracies are good or authoritarians are good, but there's I think a really, the African continent is a really, really interesting example of where there are flawed democracies in which, different societal values exist. And that's just how democracies also work. They are about different people, and we're talking about a continent of billions of people. And so in that sense, a focus really on what it is that makes a good, productive society and economy thrive, I think is always going to be better than moralizing in one way or another. But that's, to end off, I think that shouldn't ignore where there are gross human rights violations, where there are, governments that are waging war against their own people. I don't think we want to get into a scenario that is that. But there is, I think, a huge difference between, again, moralizing on the one side and completely ignoring, I think, human rights violations on the other.
Yeah, and one of the questions that I had teed up for today was about the human rights issues in Angola. President Lourenço, who has been a mainstay of Angolan politics since the independence in 1975, his government has been accused of extrajudicial killings and violent crackdowns on protesters in recent years. This has been documented by the U.S. State Department, Amnesty International. In the 3-day trip that Biden engaged in, there wasn't a lot of talk about human rights, and I'm sure that has been a criticism. So I'm not attempting to sort of say that we should abandon our focus, like you said, Ziyanda, on human rights issues, but it did seem like in this particular trip that the focus was more of this realistic approach to how do we help Angola sort of develop its own economic vitality through these projects. I'd like to move over to some Q&A from our listeners, and I wanted to make sure I banked in a little time for that. And we've been getting a few really good questions. And this one is in particular about Angola. It's from Melissa Cook. And she says, Angola has a holistic economic development approach. They want to make Lobito a true economic corridor benefiting agriculture, manufacturing, telecoms, power transmission, etc. She says, I'm not a Trump fan, but remember the Build Africa Act, which created Prosper Africa and funded DFC, which was enacted during his first administration, the first Trump administration. I worked a lot on USTDA funded projects, including the new Environmental and Social Impact Assessment Study for the Lobito project. And she says, so I hope the Doge doesn't close it. So this wasn't a question, but more of some context from Melissa Cook. Dan, it does seem like there had been some efforts at these economic projects during the Trump administration. Is there any risk that some of them will fall off because there seems to be more of a focus in the Trump administration at cutting government programs and costs and expenditures, and that this might just like things like this might just kind of fall within that sort of basket of things that the Doge can focus on.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Melissa. I think you know, there that's always, I think there's a lot of uncertainty with Donald Trump's next term as president. This Doge is, I think they're trying to really take a pretty a comprehensive look at the government and make some pretty serious slashes, the likes we haven't seen in decades. So I do think some of these initiatives could be on the cutting blocks. We'll have to wait and see. Prosper Africa, Melissa's right, was a very good program that was initiated in 2018. I think it officially came into force in 2019, and it tried to sort of create a one-stop shop between 17 different U.S. government agencies and departments to try and cut through some of the red tape and bureaucracy that some companies might run into as they're trying to do business in Africa, or African companies trying to do business in the US. So there was a lot of benefit there. Having spoken with some folks about it, I think it hasn't quite lived up to the potential expectation, but there are a lot of deals that it has helped facilitate, over 2,000 since it came into force. And I think I counted 12 specifically in Angola. So there's that's a good model for the sort of project that could be continued. It could be perhaps enhanced. I think there's some issue with staffing at the secretariat level. Perhaps that does get cut in Doge. Perhaps the funding isn't there. Perhaps DFC funding, especially on projects in Africa, goes down. I'm not sure. But, as the new government, I think, sees, competition with China as being a central component, I do think there's a possibility here where competition can lead to some good things. It can lead to the United States providing some, sophisticated infrastructure projects across Africa. In a capitalist society where money talks, some competition can incentivize people to engage positively. I think there's also opportunity here for cooperation. The Chinese have invested $1 billion on the eastern portion of what is likely to be the eastern portion of the Lobito Corridor, the Tazara Railway. And is there a possibility here for the U.S. to actually cooperate with the Chinese, perhaps in building that line through Tanzania to the Dar es Salaam port on the Indian Ocean? I mean, under a Trump presidency, perhaps cooperation with the Chinese seems unlikely, but it's a possibility. Regardless, I think there should be, incentive to invest in Africa through Prosper Africa, through the renewal of AGOA as well. One criticism is that these efforts are a bit too bilateral and they're not as multilateral as perhaps Africans would want. Africa's, created a free trade area that is the largest, either the largest or is going to be the largest in the world. So there's an opportunity for more multilateral engagement. But, I think there is hope that, some of these investments will continue and new ones will come to fruition under his presidency.
Dan, I would suggest sending you over to the Trump administration so you could be an advisor, because I really like what you're saying, but I don't want to lose you at the Global South program at Quincy. But they need people who have these positive vision and remind the Trump administration that some of these projects actually do work and can work well if there is the right focus on them. We have a question from Lynn Graybill that is concerned about BRICS, which is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping, and which has been in the news quite a bit. They've added some new members, and they're sort of representing the sort of anti-West or non-aligned of the global South and other countries who are looking for alternatives to the Western financial system, alternatives and runs around sanctions, which have affected many of these countries and their relationships with others. And Trump has come out recently and to the question of whether, the BRICS has been talking about a new financial system, a new currency away from the dollar. This is all in a nascent stage here. It's not even, in reality, but it's been a conversation and a part of a broader question about multilateralism. And he came out and said that he would punish severely any BRICS country that moves away from the dollar. Lynn Graybill has this question: are you concerned about his threats regarding BRICS? Ziyanda, do you have any thoughts of what the Trump relationship to BRICS would be? Because on one hand, he has good relations with many of these leaders. On the other, they're clearly trying to move away from the West.
Yeah. Really good question that I think, as you just described, bifurcates the group quite a bit. I think very much on the one hand, you have Iran, you have, that's part of the larger BRICS grouping. You have Iran, you have Russia and China, who are very happy to have the group be a platform for, this real challenge to the Western order, if you want to put it that way. And then you have more of your global South swing states, and here, Brazil, South Africa, and India are I think well represented, and that obviously would push back against that idea. So I think the group in and of itself is still going to be sort of fluid in the way that it thinks of itself as a grouping. Started a couple of years ago, not even really having had that huge ambition. But rather sort of put together by I think it was a moniker or a motto that was coined by somebody from, Goldman Sachs. So this definitely didn't start as a huge geopolitical ambitious group, but a very, very practical one built around trade and diplomacy. To answer Lynn's question, no. And this is mostly because, as much as Putin had held I think it was an example of what he would eventually want to call a BRICS dollar, to rival the US dollar. That is such a far off pipe dream. When you think about what it would take to build a common currency, you also need a common central bank. And I know, our own central bank governor in South Africa would never give up, South Africa's sovereign independence over its monetary policy. I don't think that would be true in India and several other countries that are part of the expanded BRICS group. So, if you ask me in 30 years, is something that's focused, or is a group that's focused on de-dollarization and a real challenge to the West, is that possible? Yes. If you ask me the next 3 years, I would say far less so.
I have one other question, and thank you for that. And that was very comprehensive. Lizzie, I have one other question, and this is going back to our conversation on China. It's a question that came over email by Anne Moisan, and she says, is there a smarter way for the G7 and the US to leverage/use the existing China investment to further enhance growth in Africa, rather than trying to replicate the China pattern, similar to how China leverages US security-focused investments? I'm getting from this that she's asking, is there any way that we could positively work with China and take advantage of the fact that they are there and building all these things, instead of setting it up as part of our great power conflict?
Well, I think for starters, all of China's infrastructure investment on the continent has benefits for anybody who wants to engage on the continent, right? So, again, the various roads and railways and other kind of physical infrastructure that enhances transportation that China has already invested in makes it easier for American businesses to come in and engage in trade. It makes it faster to get things to port, faster to get things to trade. So fundamentally, I think that the United States seeing Chinese investment on the continent as a big threat to us is a mistake. I think it's a fundamental mistake. But at the same time, I don't think that means that we shouldn't also be investing in infrastructure on the continent for a couple of reasons. One being, it's massive. There is so much need for infrastructure development in so many different parts of the continent. If you want to try and build better access for goods to get to market, build better access for the many resources, valuable resources on the continent that, Americans and Europeans and others need for, everything from tech to security issues. So I don't think this is an either or. I think that at the end of the day, it is unfortunate that the United States and China see this much more from, kind of a purely competitive perspective, because I think that we both benefit more from each of us investing more in the continent. I mean, this, from population, just the explosion in population there, it's going to be a place where if you're not investing in Africa and we're not all working towards the continent being more well integrated into the global economy, I think everyone's going to see a cost to that. So, but that said, it's natural. The United States and China are in a big geopolitical competition. So my hope is that African leaders are able to play them against each other in the most brilliant way to get the maximum impact for their own states and their people. That might not be up to us, but, played well, I think, countries like Angola can benefit from those railways coming from both directions. And so I don't see this as a problem for the United States. I don't see us as switching our focus to being more cooperative. But I think that both countries really being fixated on trying to expand economic engagement and infrastructure development is going to be can really be a positive outcome for Africans.
And since we have a few minutes left, I would love to just shift up to the Horn of Africa, and I'm not sure if you feel comfortable talking about this, but Lizzie, you brought up the issue of Sudan and how there are foreign proxies involved on both sides of that brutal conflict, and the suffering of the people there as a result. I also see that in the Horn of Africa, there are a lot of Middle Eastern influences in what's going on in Somalia and Somaliland and Ethiopia and Eritrea. And can you talk a little bit about what the United States can do, if anything, to sort that out, or at least kind of take our allies or partners in the region and tell them to extricate or to find ways to resolve the conflicts there diplomatically before they truly get out of hand and become more regional crises, which they seemingly are right now.
Well, I do think that it is you've got a series of very big security and humanitarian crises happening across the Horn. They are going to start bleeding into each other and further complicating each other. And even for those who do not care about some 25 million people at risk of famine right now in Sudan, hopefully people care more about stability. Your basic question of, is it possible for the U.S. to do more? 100%. What matters, what it will really take, is just raising it on our political priority level. And right now, it's simply not. You look at 20 years ago with the war in Sudan, with Darfur, and there was a tremendous push for action out of Congress, out of the American public, and that led to results and really solid engagement from the White House that really did help resolve that conflict and reduce the suffering. We need political will. We also need to acknowledge, the U.S. government needs to acknowledge its level of influence and sway with some of these countries. The challenge, like just focusing in on one, and there are many, many examples of this, but let's just say the UAE's engagement in Sudan, which is very unhelpful. The problem there is that we have, 15, 25 other issues that we care about with the UAE. And its engagement in Sudan as a priority is just really low on that list. So I think, for people out there who care about these issues, raise alarm, talk to your representatives in Washington and push it more. And hopefully there will be a constituency that can make the U.S. government care more about raising the priority level, not just about the people of Sudan, but about that entire region's stability. If we've got to sell it as, look at all of these great economic opportunities for your donors, then so be it. But whatever we can do to get more focus there.
So for my last question, I just like to do a little round robin and ask you, so in the coming months, the first year of the Trump administration, what are you personally focused on in terms of the continent, and what flashpoints, what indicators are you looking for that might reflect or suggest what a broader policy is? In other words, what's going to come up on your radar and you say, okay, we know what's happening now? Like, what are you looking at personally as a researcher and a scholar in Africa today? I'll start with you, Ziyanda.
Okay, so I think the G20 summit is probably front of mind for me. That's going to be hosted by South Africa in 2025, and I think is a huge year both for South Africa itself, but also for US South Africa relationships. And I think really importantly will signal where we're going with platforms like AGOA, as well as other, I think, larger sort of foreign policy pieces related to the continent. If the US Secretary of State, maybe that's going to be Marco Rubio. Let's see who that ends up being. If they travel to South Africa in February for the G20 foreign ministers meeting, I think that will really sort of signal that there could be a much greater and more productive relationship between the US and its broader foreign policy architecture and the African continent.
Very interesting. And when's that G20 summit?
November next year.
Okay. Lizzie?
Mine is personnel. I'm looking to see who gets appointed for Assistant Secretary for Africa. I'm looking to see if he's appointing special envoys to anything in particular. Let's say let's say some major appointments go to in-laws. I will know that he does not particularly care about what is going to happen. Let's say it goes to, big multinational corporation, founders. Maybe they're going to care a lot about expanding business. Is he going to appoint, special envoy to Sudan? Is it going to be someone who's super close with with our Middle East partners? Or is it going to be an evangelical who actually has a track record of caring about humanitarian outcomes? And those are going to be the signals that I'm looking for. And you better believe I'm going to go look at, any social media postings for whoever he appoints to see, is this one of the folks who said we're going to recognize Somaliland, or is this somebody who, focused on a totally different issue? So since the White House won't care, I'm going to see what the personnel who are appointed are going to care about most.
Excellent. Dan?
Yeah, similar to Lizzie, I think it's important to see who he appoints into these positions. Is he going to put someone as special envoy on Sudan? And then, I am hopeful, as I think I've mentioned, on the economic front. So on the security front, I have more questions and would be curious to see who's in those positions and what the early few months might indicate as to his policy on Sudan, the Horn of Africa, and the Sahel as well, where the U.S. has had a very checkered kind of policy past. So those are the regions I would really try and focus on to try and understand how much of a priority they are and what his policy might look like for his second term.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I want to leave the program today just by bringing our audience back to our Global South program. Please go to the Quincy Institute website. Look up Global South under program areas. It's a new program, basically, and I'm reading now from the site. We're helping to fashion a new bargain between the United States and the Global South, including its middle powers, to deepen ties and enhance U.S. influence in the vast region in less militarized ways, in part by bringing their voices and perspectives into Washington's policy-making spheres. So please check out that exciting new program, of which Dan is a research fellow. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. I really enjoyed this conversation and all of your insights. And I know you'll be joining us again at some point as well. So thank you.